pray. Speak to us afresh, Lord, in ways that make their way into our marrow, our very being, so that we're shaped by your love, inspired by your example, challenged by your teaching, brought up short when we make mistakes. But help us, Lord, to love in the direction of that Samaritan in that story. And may my words this morning and the meditations of our hearts, may these things be acceptable in your sight, for you are our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. A couple of weeks ago, I began with a question. Anybody remember that far back? The question was, where am I headed? I suggested that questions, sometimes even more than the answers, can guide us, inspire us, help to shape us as we wrestle not only with the questions but our own personal response to them. And so if we pay attention to our ultimate destination, if our destination is to grow as followers of Jesus Christ and in relationship with God, that destination will help us make decisions along the way. This morning I'd like to raise another one of life's important questions, and it is this: who is my neighbor? It's the question that the attorney asked Jesus in this important lesson from the Gospel of Luke. Who is my neighbor? I hope you'll take that question and put it in your pocket and take it with you when you leave church this morning, and allow that question to sort of, like leaven in the loaf, work in your spirit to help shape you. Who is my neighbor? There's a cute story about neighbors. It seems there was a woman named Margaret and her son John, and they lived next door to a very elderly widow named Mildred. And Margaret grew concerned when she didn't see Mildred for a week. And so she turned to her son, John. She said, "John, I haven't seen Mildred for a week. Will you go next door and see how old Mildred is?" And John said, okay, and he went next door, and he came back in a few moments, and he said, "Mildred's fine, but she's perturbed with you." And Margaret said, "Well, why is she perturbed?" She said, "Because how old she is none of your business." You just got it, did you? Anyway, who's my neighbor is a pretty important question, and people have been wrestling with that for centuries, trying to define what should my circle of concern be? How far should I stretch? There was an author who made a splash in 1957 named Ayn Rand, who wrote a well-known book. I read it. It's good reading, called Atlas Shrugged, in which she essentially put forth the idea that you don't even need to worry about the neighbor, that just life is tough enough. Just take care of yourself. Operate in your daily living out of a sense of enlightened self-interest, and everything else will fall into place. And I read online a couple of weeks ago that there's a billionaire you may have heard of named Mark Cuban, who credits Ayn Rand with a lot of his success in life, and was kind of advocating for that philosophy for living. And I just mention that because I disagree. I really think that life calls us, it demands us. God wants us to stretch beyond our own selves to connect with our neighbor. So if we do connect, well, how far then do we need to connect beyond ourselves? A place that folks who've wrestled with this issue have started is, well, with your own family anyway. You ought to care about people to whom you are biologically connected. Your father, your mother, your brothers, your sisters, maybe even to your aunts and uncles and your cousins, that the biological connections ought to bind us. In fact, the ancient Jews thought that the family was so important in terms of caring for family that they designated a person in every family. It was usually the eldest male in the family as the patriarch. They gave a term to that person. They called him the Goel. And Goel translates literally as the Redeemer. So that if anybody in a family ever got in trouble with the law, or they were running short of cash and needed some help, or they were going down the wrong path, it would be the Redeemer's job and role in the family to marshal the family resources in such a way to help out that person in the family who had gone in a wayward direction. Now, I know already that by suggesting that in the answer to the question, who's my neighbor, we start with our family. We've already got some families. You don't have to raise your hand, but I'll self-confession. My family, there are persons in that genetic circle who don't get along. Can you believe that? It's probably, they not only don't get along, but they haven't spoken to each other for years. And if you suggested, hey, let's go to a family reunion, no way, I'm not going there. And that's just the truth. The story of the first murder that ever took place in the Bible is not between total strangers. It's people who are biologically connected as brothers. But even if you don't get along with members of your family, I'd like to suggest that who's my neighbor, your family ought to be included. And if you're not comfortable with that, wrestle with it. Allow that question to keep doing its thing. Neighborliness extends beyond family, however. The ancient Jews discovered that it was important, and it really is, that we find ways to get along and be related to people who may not be biologically related to us, but we need to work and live together. And so they established something that has many different forms in life that are very helpful, called covenant community, in which people said, okay, I will subscribe to these laws and these values, and I will observe these traditions and these customs, and we will be in this together. And I happen to believe that life works a whole lot better than all of us have lives that are much better, because we do live in a covenant community, and that people have said yes in the United Methodist Church to I will order my life after the example of Christ, that this child will be surrounded with steadfast love and confirmed and strengthened in the way that leads to life eternal. It works in the United States of America because, as people, in school, at least we used to do this, at the beginning of the day, stand up and say, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States. These shared values bind us together in a sense of neighborliness. And so Jesus has this conversation with this attorney who wants to know, what do I have to do, Jesus, to inherit eternal life? As Jesus didn't answer the question, he asked the attorney, what does the law teach? And the attorney centered in on what Jesus had identified as the two greatest commandments. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus said, you've answered right. And then the attorney said, yeah, but who's my neighbor? And Jesus responded, not with a philosophical answer that defined neighbor. He told a story. And this is the story Jesus told. We've heard it before. Anybody here never heard the Good Samaritan story before this morning? The story has a man who's not really identified, traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho. It's a 15-mile stretch of road, It is a precipitous road. It goes through a steep descent of 3,600 feet in those 15 miles. It's believed by some that that road inspired King David when he wrote the psalm, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." The road is geographically is I tried to think of the equivalent in the United States. If you've ever been through the Badlands of North Dakota, which I did last week, and then take the Badlands and mix in Death Valley. You've got the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. Where it ends in Jericho at the level of the Dead Sea is 800 feet below sea level, and it's the lowest area on dry land on the face of the earth. And this traveler goes along, gets beaten up. It probably was not an uncommon occurrence, and left to die on the side of the road. And then Jesus tells the story of the passers-by. I don't imagine on a road like that the passers-by were clipping by very quickly, but along came a priest. And when I was a kid and I first heard this story, I thought, that priest. How could a priest pass him by? I confess, I've been in ministry now 40 years. I understand how the priest could pass him by. Full calendar, lots of obligations, places to go, people to meet, things to do. The laws are very clear in the Old Testament about ritual purity, and if he came in contact with another person's blood, it would put him on the bench, having to go through a series of ritual purifications before he could get back and lead in the responsibility. And he probably just said, I've got too much, I just can't do it all. And he passed by. I give the priest a pass. I understand that. And then the Levite came along, and I used to think the same thing about the Levite. But the Levites, if you remember, were of the tribe of Aaron, the first high priest. They were set aside by the entire people of God to study the law, to observe the law, to communicate the law, to live the law, to teach the law. And he probably realized, too, if he came in contact with the other person's blood, he passed by, too. It happens all the time on highways all across America, because we've all heard stories even when we're passing by. You're going by at 60 miles an hour today, and you're in a hurry, and you've got things to do and places to meet, and there are emergency personnel that can take care of that. And then along comes a Samaritan. And to me, the Samaritan always is the hero of the story. I think, wow, this is... Can you imagine in a conversation today between a supporter of Hillary Clinton and a supporter of Donald Trump, offering an illustration that the other person to this person is actually good? The Samaritans and Jews hated each other. They had a long history of animosity. And when Jesus mentioned the Samaritan to a good Jew, already you could sense the toxic nature of that illustration. But that Samaritan stopped, bound the man's wounds, took him to the inn, covered the bill, said, if there's anything more I can do, I'll be happy to come back and pay for it, and then said, well, who's the neighbor? I need you to know that this is not just another biblical story for your pastor. It is autobiographical for me. In 2001, I was studying the Bible on location in Israel. It was Friday, January 5th, 2001. It was Greek Orthodox Christmas Eve. We, as part of this course through Jerusalem University College, had gone to Bethlehem earlier in the day as the Church of the Nativity was getting ready for big festivities with the Orthodox Christians that night. And then we got in the bus and traveled on the Jerusalem to Jericho Road. And we stopped at a place called Wadi Kilt, which is a famous hiking path. And we parked the bus by the side of the road and hiked up to the top of a mountain where Wink Thompson, our professor who had spent his life studying the Bible in that part of the world, pointed out the landscape around us. And he said, over there is the Mount of Temptation. That's the place that traditionally people have recognized that Jesus went to wrestle with Satan in the wilderness at the start of his ministry for 40 days. And then he pointed out the road, the Jerusalem-Jericho road that you could see snaking down and around on its way from Jerusalem to Jericho. And he said that's the place that inspired David, we think, to write, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow. And then he said, and as far as the 23rd Psalm goes, he said, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And then it was one of those moments, he didn't script it, but at the moment he talked about the Lord is my shepherd, here comes a Bedouin shepherd with his sheep coming up the mountain. It was one of those magical moments. And when he got done, the presentation, he talked about, and over there's where we think the Good Samaritan story happened, and not far from there on that road is an inn that's been there for many years that people say that's probably the place where the wounded traveler was cared for. And then he said, if you want to take some pictures, go ahead and take some pictures. And then we're going to hike back down to the bus. And I decided I wanted to get a picture of that 5th century Byzantine St. George's monastery that was carved dramatically in the side of the cliff. And I started walking down the mountain. And I thought I was on solid rock. What I discovered was when I moved down the mountain moved with me. When I come from the parsonage, if I walk to the church and come down the sand dune, and you walk down the sand gives way under your feet. And what happened was that what I thought was solid rock was a shelf of loose limestone gravel that suddenly, with my weight on it, it just flew out. My leg came up in the air, came down, and limestone is a lot less forgiving than sand, and my leg snapped in 2 places, the tibia and fibula, and suddenly I was lying on the ground, helpless, in extraordinary pain, and my ankle feeling like jelly. And I felt in my marrow what that traveler must have felt like in that environment. I looked around and said, if I didn't have help here, I'd be a dead man. And fortunately, we had a doctor who was a part of our group who knew how to splint my leg. Wink Thompson had a cell phone, and miraculously, even in the wilderness of Israel, they had cell service. And he called Hadassah Hospital, and they sent out the ambulance service. And a couple of Orthodox Jews, I'd never had any contact with Orthodox Jews in my life before that, and they came out with their long curls, and on the eve of their Sabbath, they came up the mountain, and they strapped me to a bodyboard and schlepped me down and put me in the back of an ambulance that was donated by the Jews of Chicago. I will be forever indebted that people cared enough about, medical care in the Middle East, in Chicago, that they donated an ambulance, and that ambulance carried me to Hadassah Hospital, where on their Sabbath day, they opened the operating room just for me. Performed the surgery, and then I went back to my room. It was an 8-bed ward with 4 Jews, 3 Palestinians, and me. And we spoke different languages, worshiped in different ways, grew up in different environments, and in that space and time, it made no difference. One of the Jews was multilingual, and he translated for the group. One of the Palestinians owned a restaurant, and his family brought in food that we could enjoy, and we took turns taking care of each other. It was a marvelous experience of community, based on a shared sense of our humanity that I wished I could share with everybody in the world, that wouldn't the world be a better place? And I'd like to tell you that that experience was transformative for me, that it really did it, so that every time now that I have an opportunity to be a neighbor and cross boundaries, I'm all for it. I'd be a liar. So some years after that, family had the opportunity to travel to Tibet up in the Himalayas. It was just the Wagner family on a tour that was arranged by a friend. And one of the stops on the tour was a Tibetan Buddhist monastery up at the top of another mountain. We hiked up the top of the mountain, and somebody must have shared the word that there were Americans in town, because when we came out of the Buddhist monastery, after a wonderful tour, lining the mountain all the way from the monastery back down to our car were beggars. Not just one. There were just a beggar here, and 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 all the way down to the car. And they were all calling out. I don't do Tibetan, but it sounded like something like alms for the poor. And as I got out, I thought, I'm a pastor. I don't have this kind of cash. I can't take care of the poverty in Tibet. And I just sort of steeled myself to do this. Has that ever happened? Am I the only one? It just kind of walk on by all the way down to the car. I got in the car. I felt awful. But I thought, if I helped every one of those beggars, I wouldn't have enough money to get home. And I turned around when I got in the car, and I looked, and following us down the mountain was a Buddhist monk. And he was dressed in a robe and simple sandals. And he paused at every beggar. It may have helped that he understood the language, but he paused at every beggar. And he spoke to every beggar personally, as if he knew them. He probably did. And he reached in his bag for every beggar. And he shared something with each one. And then he'd come down the mountain to the next one, and he'd talk, and he'd reach in his bag, and he shared something with them. And as he was coming down the mountain, so I talked to our guide. I said, I have to talk to that monk when he gets down. And when the monk got down, I engaged him. I said, how did you do this? How can you afford, you don't look like you're made, how can you afford to help every one of those beggars? And he explained to me that he didn't give them much. He gave them each the equivalent of an American nickel. But he said for each of them, it was important, and it was important for him too. And I learned a valuable lesson that day about being a neighbor. So, who is my neighbor? I hope the story that Jesus tells us about the Good Samaritan percolates in us, particularly this week, after we heard in the headlines another horrible report about people gunning down people in Dallas, Texas, and others in other parts of the country. And we really do need people. This world, this community, your families, the covenant community of which we're a part. We need folks who are touched and blessed with God's sense of neighbor. Each of us are so valuable that God gave the most precious thing that He had for our redemption. I pray that we can use ourselves to help share that love with others. Christ tells us it's the path to eternal life, and I believe it. Amen.